I wish I did.
And we'll call this June 7th, 2022 regular session of the Findlay City Council meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bowman?
Here.
Mr. Greeno? Here. Mr. Hellman?
Here.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Here.
Mr. Palmer?
Here.
Mr. Russell?
Here.
Mr. Slough?
Here.
Ms. Warnicki?
Here.
Mr. Weisner?
Here.
Mr. Wobser?
Present.
And indeed, I am not Council President John Harrington. I am Grant Russell, President Pro Tem. The Mayor Mern is out of town, and when the mayor is gone, John slides over to be the acting mayor, and I come across here to be acting City Council President, which is why I am here today. So I don't know, John, do we need to excuse the mayor from the meeting? Okay. And with that, we will have the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Amen. We have acceptance or changes to our May 17th regular session of City Council minutes. Mr. Slough?
So moved.
Second, Mr. Niemeyer. All in favor of accepting the minutes as published, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign, and they are accepted. Councilman Wobser, do we have an add-on to the agenda?
We have one add-on tonight. It is a letter from the HRPC grant administrator, Lizzie Essinger. This will go into the reports of municipal officers and municipal departments section of this evening, and it is a CDBG allocation application program for 2022. I would make a motion that that be added to our agenda tonight.
We have a motion second. Mr. Slough, all those in favor of adding it to the agenda, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, same sign, and it is added to the agenda. We'll roll right down into oral communications. I do not see Ann, so James Loudon, you are up, sir. How about that? We're quick. Mr. Loudon, we're a pretty easy, casual bunch. You have 4 minutes to speak, and right there is great. Thank you.
There may be a button on there that you want to push so the red light shines.
Gotcha.
You're good.
Thank you. James Loudon, been a Hancock County resident going on 76 years this Friday. I've been active in conservation in Hancock County. Probably used the river, Eagle Creek, over 60 years. I received the Division of Wildlife Award in 1988, removed nuisance wildlife for 15 years in Hancock County. Went from 1975 to 1990. Removed them, released them back to their natural habitat. I'm concerned about lowering the dam because the results and the consequences, anybody can look and see what happened to the Liberty Street Dam. It's no longer a navigable waterway. Loss of fisheries, probably about 80%. If you lower the dam down there, Riverside Park Dam, you're going to create issues because down there at they call it the Horseshoe, and it's the Riverside Park Reservoir, really. There's another old dam that's only partially removed. The Blanchard River comes out of the golf course and replenishes that smaller reservoir. That is great for fisheries, Ed Bear, Carl Stover, 2-3 pound bass easy. If you lower the waterways, they're going to be trapped in there. And it depends, if you lower it too much, the water will not feed in from the Blanchard River. You're going to have a smelly mess. Country club members will have to wear gas masks at 8 and 9 hole. I am familiar with that area. I used to dive for golf balls when I was in my youth. I can make more money diving for golf balls down there than I could mowing yards. The executives of your companies, doctors and lawyers, all your membership is going to create a heck of an odor with a fish kill. Had issues with the North Dam. Out at number 2 reservoir, they were going to remove that one and the one on the east of the reservoir. That is a feed resource for our water at number 2 reservoir, number 1 reservoir. It gets pumped in from the river, goes into 2. That's dirty water, then goes over 1, and then it's gravity fed into the treatment plant. This down there at the Riverside Park Dam is the valve that they can pull water from behind the dam and go to the treatment plant. They never had to use it for a long time, but it's a backup. 1988, the number 2 reservoir is over 15 feet low. We had to pump water out of the artesian wells at Van Loo. You shorten them people's water supply also. When you pump there, and when they were going to remove that, I sent the letter in. I got one copy was fresh water. Let's see which one. Fresh water equals. Sorry, I'm just a little bit nervous about this crap. Fresh water equals life. At that time, Lillian Mahalik, the old mayor, and her staff or the engineers stopped them from removing that dam that's out there by the pump station. Fresh water equals life, what it was. But, boy, think seriously about messing around with the waterways. You can go deeper. You got the 7 quarries outside of the fairgrounds. Lye Creek dumps in and Eagle Creek dumps in to a non-navigable waterway and a very poor resource for our fisheries. You could go deeper, better than wider, my opinion. And you can go deeper because they got the 7 quarries there. You got Lake Cascades, you got the Tar Box Quarry. It's better to go deeper than wider. Loss of habitat was the turtles, bullfrogs, muskrats. I used to trap down there when I was a kid. No more muskrats. If I get a snapping turtle on my line or a box trap and it's 10 7/8 inch, I got to turn it loose, release it. It's got to be 11 inches in length. I was concerned about how many of the construction destroyed when they benched that down there. I don't know. But the Hancock County sportsmen's, or the Ohio sportsmen's, got laws and rules to follow. County government should too, and so should city government.
Thank you, Mr. Loudon. Questions
Okay.
or comments? Mr. Wobser.
Mr. Loudon, thank you for coming in.
Yep.
Do you agree that we should do something behind that dam?
All right, you look at the letter. Yes, I do.
And what would that be?
There's a fleet of 13 dredgers the ODNR's got.
So dredging?
Dredging is better than lowering the dam.
Do you agree that we should have an entry pathway for the fish to move up and down the dam?
No, not at all, because the lower the dam, with the elevation, there's no natural waterways, no habitat for them. It's too shallow now when they took away the daggone Liberty Street Dam.
Other questions or comments for Mr. Loudon?
Dredging critical to safe boating is page 2. He started this out in 1972 out at Van Buren State Park. He went in there with a dredger. It was the first one they tried. Do you want me to go for it or you want me to stop?
I think if there's any other questions,
Okay, finished. Wrap her up.
you're all set. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Do appreciate it. And I do not see Ann here for her oral comments. Ann Spence had asked to speak. Do not see her. So we'll move on to our reports of municipal officers and municipal departments.
Is there any opportunity for anybody else to bring anything up?
There was a form to fill out to address council. You want to help them out? Tell you what, we'll get you back in here when you get the form filled out, and we'll slide you in. All right? Thank you.
Go ahead and go.
So we're gonna keep moving on with reports of municipal officers and departments, and when this gentleman is ready to go, we'll have him do his oral communications.
City Planning Commission agenda for June 16th, 2022, as well as the minutes of May 11th, 2022.
Questions or comments? Agenda and minutes be filed.
Officer shareholders disclosure form from the Ohio Department of Commerce Division of Liquor Control for 10 Star Enterprises Incorporated doing business as Scramblers at 516 South Main Street for a D5I liquor permit.
Mr. Slough?
I would move no objection be filed.
Second, Mr. Ballman. Questions or comments?
Discussion.
Or discussion, excuse me?
This is the first time I've ever seen one of these come through that has no names on it, so they couldn't run any background checks. So I'm not really sure what we're approving here. How can we approve this without any background checks actually being done?
If I may,
Mr. Hellman?
thank you. I was gonna mention the same thing. In fact, I'm tempted to vote no on it. If we don't have any information, it makes no sense to pass this thing on.
I would think that we need to have individuals who are in charge of this liquor permit, as we do with every other one that we've approved.
Ms. Warnicki?
Well, I was trying to read this and read it 5 or 6 times and still was trying to totally figure out what it was telling me. Denise, do you know what that normally says? Doesn't it say that the whoever gives this is giving it? And this one just says it's a disclosure form. Are they actually saying they're going to let them have one? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, it's the same form what I always receive, and then the police department receives a similar form with the list of applicant names and social security numbers. But after numerous phone calls and emails, they're refusing, saying it's a master file, they do not have to provide that.
I just thought that top sentence normally says that someone's declaring that they're going to give them the right, and it doesn't read that way either. It just says disclosure. So I was, I guess like everybody else, somewhat baffled by the sentence altogether.
I'm not sure where you're referring, I guess. To me, this is the exact same form we always get.
Okay. I wasn't questioning you, per se.
I did inform them that, we require that background check, and it's a possibility that it won't get passed and it will die at this point. And they were fine with that, so I didn't know what to do.
So options available. We have a motion to file no objection and a second. We could table this. That's always an option, and get an explanation as to why this is different, and a better explanation. We could vote to we could vote on the motion that no objection be filed, and in essence vote that, and however you deem it necessary or deem it correct. Mr. Baumann.
But I mean, this is Scrambler Marie's. It's not like it's a fly-by-night operation, correct?
Correct.
But still, I understand your point, Brian. I would think, though, that somebody still has to be on the line for the alcohol permit.
Mr. Hellman.
Yeah, I was gonna say, somebody owns Scrambler Marie's. I mean, there's a corporation, and if I remember right, they're out of state, I think, anymore. So, I mean,
10-Star Enterprises.
I'd suggest we do whatever we can to decline it. Go from there.
Mr. Weisner.
I mean, I'm in agreement with Brian. It's a business here in downtown, here in Findlay. However, I think we owe it to the residents that obviously they told Denise they don't care if we turn it down, then obviously they don't care. So
Well,
I'm in line to vote no.
The history of if we would file an objection, or we would not pass this, it goes to the Ohio Liquor Board, and they generally have granted the license anyway, making this whole process probably some statutorily required show. If you want an explanation before giving it consideration, I would suggest a motion to table.
So moved.
We have a motion to table for Mr. Hellman. Is there a second? Mr. Niemeyer. All those in favor of tabling this request, please say aye.
Aye.
We'll do that on a roll call.
Mr. Greeno?
Nay.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
So the nays mean not in favor of accepting the
Correct. No, this is a motion to table.
table. Okay, sorry. Mr. Niemeyer? Aye. Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Nay.
Mr. Slough? Nay. Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Weisner?
Nay.
Mr. Wobser?
Nay.
And Mr. Bowman?
Nay.
So the motion to table fails. 4 in the affirmative, 6 in the negative. We have a motion on the. We have a motion to that no objection be filed, and we'll do a roll call vote on the motion that no objection be filed.
Mr. Hellman?
No.
Mr. Niemeyer? No. Mr. Palmer?
Nay.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Aye. Ms. Warnicki?
Nay.
Mr. Weisner?
Nay.
Mr. Wobser?
Nay.
And Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
And Mr. Greeno?
Nay.
So the motion to that no objection be filed fails by a vote of 3 affirmative, 7 against, and we will move on.
A letter from Mayor Mern regarding Hometown Hero banner program.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed.
Letter from Service Safety Director Martin regarding first floor municipal building replacement windows.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed.
Traffic Commission minutes for May 16th, 2022.
Questions or comments? Minutes be filed.
A letter from City Engineer Kalb regarding the NICE recorder.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed.
City Income Tax Monthly Collections Report for May 2022.
Questions or comments? Report be filed.
Letter from City Auditor Stashak regarding ARPA funds.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed.
Letter from City Engineer Kalb regarding Madison and Monroe Sanitary Phase 2, project number 356-21200.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed.
Findlay Fire Department Activities Report for May 2022.
Questions or comments? Reports be filed.
Findlay Police Departmental Activities Report for May 2022.
Question or comments? Report be filed.
Letter from Hancock Regional Planning Commission Grant Administrator Lizzie Essinger regarding CDBG Allocation Application Program Year 2022.
Questions or comments? Letter be filed. And we will move on to committee reports.
Just want to make sure we don't want to read that CBD.
Correct.
Okay. The Strategic Planning Committee met on May 17th, 2022 to discuss the documents included in the strategic plan study. We recommend that the public be allowed to submit plans to Planning Next to be included in the document list. 1 week will be given for submission from the date of announcement. These documents will be for reference use by Planning Next.
Questions or comments? Mr. Wobser.
Make a
sorry.
motion to accept the committee report.
Second, Mr. Ballman. Questions or comments? Sorry, my peripheral vision will get better. All those in favor of accepting the committee report, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Committee report is accepted.
The Appropriations Committee, to whom is referred a request to discuss American Rescue Plan Act funds. We recommend that the mayor bring forward with planning for ARPA funds and bring them to this committee when ready for discussion.
Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to accept the committee report.
Second, Mr. Greeno. Questions or comments? All in favor of accepting the committee report, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Committee report is accepted.
The Appropriations Committee, to whom is referred a request to discuss the property acquisition of 3 Taylor Street properties. We recommend to move forward with the purchase of the properties. However, want a conversation with the county commissioners about them purchasing with flood mitigation funds.
Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to approve.
Second, Mr. Palmer. Questions or comments? All those in favor of accepting the committee report, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Committee report is accepted. Legislation. Start with resolutions.
Second reading for Resolution 14, 2022. A resolution stating what services the City of Findlay will provide to the territory proposed to be annexed to the City of Findlay, situated in Allen Township, County of Hancock, State of Ohio, and being a part of the southwest quarter of Section 36, Township 2 North, Range 10 East, a tract of land consisting of 3.978 acres of land, more or less. First reading for Resolution 15, 2022. A resolution approving the expenditures made by the Auditor's Office on the attached list of vouchers which either exceed the purchase order or were incurred without a purchase order, exceeding the statutory limits of $3,000, all in accordance with Ohio Revised Code 5705.41D.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for adoption of resolution number 015-2022.
Second, Mr. Palmer. Questions or comments? All in favor of resolution 015-2022, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
and Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
The resolution is adopted.
First reading for Resolution 16, 2022, a resolution transferring funds within appropriated funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion that council's statutory rules be suspended and this resolution be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Ballman. All those in favor of suspending council's rules, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
and Mr. Oh, already, sorry.
Council statutory rules have been suspended, and this resolution will be given its second and third reading.
Resolution 16, 2022, Resolution 16, 2022.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for adoption of resolution number 16-2022.
Second, Mr. Slough. Questions or comments? All those in favor of passing resolution 016-2022, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
and Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
The resolution is adopted.
First reading for Resolution 17, 2022, a resolution transferring funds within appropriated funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
Since this is regarding our ARPA funds and we're just moving money from one account to another, I'd make a motion that this council's rules be suspended and this resolution be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Slough. We have a motion to suspend council's rules. All in favor of the motion, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
and Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
The motion to suspend council's statutory rules has been adopted, and this resolution will be given its second and third reading.
Resolution 17, 2022, Resolution 17, 2022.
Mr. Slough. Second, Mr. Hellman. Questions or comments? All in favor of adoption of resolution 017-2022, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
and Mr. Niemeyer.
The resolution is adopted. On to ordinances.
Third reading for ordinance 2022-35, an ordinance authorizing the mayor of the city of Findlay, Ohio to enroll the city of Findlay in the Bureau of Workers' Compensation Group Retrospective Rating Plan and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Hellman.
I'd move to approve ordinance 2022-035.
Second, Mr. Slough. Questions or comments? All those in favor of adoption of ordinance 2022-035, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2022-38, an ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director of the City of Findlay, Ohio, to sign all necessary documents for membership of the National Purchasing Cooperative doing business as National Buy Board and National Purchasing Cooperative and declaring an emergency. Second reading for ordinance 2022-40, an ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the city of Findlay, Ohio to execute the necessary grant application or applications and/or agreement or agreements to receive grant funds from the Federal Highway Administration, project number 328-23500, for funding of a multi-use path from the National Scenic Byways Program and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
Was this not, aren't we on a timeline on this one?
June 10.
June 10. So with that, so we can get this done, get this in on time, I'd make a motion that council statutory rules be suspended and this be given its last reading.
Mr. Weisner, second. We have a motion to suspend rules and give this motion its third reading. All those in favor of the motion to suspend, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
And Mr. Russell.
Aye. Council statutory rules have been suspended and this ordinance will be given its third reading.
Ordinance 2022-40.
Mr. Slough. Second, Mr. Greeno. Questions or comments? All those in favor of adoption of ordinance 2022-040, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
And Mr. Slough.
The ordinance is adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2022-42. An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director and/or City Engineer of the City of Findlay, Ohio to advertise for bids where required and enter into contracts for various projects, appropriating and transferring funds for said capital expenditures and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Slough. How about its third reading? Thank you. Motion to second, Mr. Baldwin. We have a motion to suspend council statutory rules and give this ordinance its third reading. All in favor of the motion, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? And Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Council statutory rules have been suspended, and this will be given its third reading.
Ordinance 2022-42.
Mr. Slough. Second, Mr. Wobser. Questions or comments? All those in favor of ordinance 2022, Mr. Hellman, sorry about that.
I apologize for being late to the switch here, but I just got a quick question. Is there a reason why we're moving this along?
There's some time-sensitive projects with lead times and supply chain issues, and I know that's a redundant excuse we've been using for a long time, but there are some projects that we'd like to get moving with lead times. So if we can get this appropriation complete tonight, we can get contractors on the hook to move forward.
Thank you for the explanation.
Other questions or comments? Seeing as though there are none, all in favor of ordinance 2022-042, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
And Mr. Weisner.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2022-43. An ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the City of Findlay, Ohio to enter into an agreement or agreements with the Ohio Department of Transportation for the Hahn Bright Road Phase 3 Fiscal Year 2023 PID 108776, project number 3282180, and declaring an emergency. Second reading for ordinance 2022-45. An ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the City of Findlay, Ohio to execute the necessary grant application or applications and/or agreement or agreements to receive grant funds from the Community Development Block Grant Program for the Cooper Rawson Park Green Infrastructure, project number 355-23600, and declaring an emergency.
So I'll start with questions real quick. Lizzie or Matt, the add-on letter that we had was related to this specific ordinance. Can you fill us in as to where we're at and what needs to happen? And
Sure.
Please.
The proposed project was a green infrastructure project. Jeremy Kaub, the city engineer, met with some consultants, and they were looking at numbers, and they were concerned that it might not have the desired effect that they wanted. It wouldn't be as effective as they had hoped. So Jeremy decided, rather than moving forward with the project with unknown outcomes, that he would pivot to a new project and do further research on the green infrastructure project. So the project that the city would like to move to is making park bathrooms at Rawson, Swale, and the airport ADA compliant. So that in a nutshell is the change in request that the engineering department would like to make. Those projects are fundable under the grant. The estimated budget would be $260,000 for those 3 restrooms. The grant would be $177,600, with the city making up the rest of the balance. Jeremy indicated that the updating the restrooms for ADA compliance is something that's been on the radar for a while.
Mr. Wobser.
I'd make a motion to amend ordinance 2022-45 per Mr. Cadanier's recommendations that we're moving from the baseball diamond moving, correct?
Correct.
To ADA compliant restrooms at the 3 locations, or 4.
That is correct.
Thank you.
3 locations.
I'd work my way through that.
And just to clarify, so in ordinance 2022-045, this is what I think I heard you say, Jeff. You're saying in section 1, the place where we talk about CDBG program for the Cooper Rawson Park Green Infrastructure and a project number, instead you're saying CDBG program for the ADA compliant restroom project.
That is exactly what I meant.
That's what I thought. So that would be the motion. Mr. Hellman seconds.
Correct.
So we have a motion to amend. So everybody understands. So we have the motion or the ordinance that we had last week or 2 weeks ago. It was introduced, and now we're amending it. We're changing it to be to this project. And so the vote we're going to take now is on whether we agree to amend the motion. So that's all we're doing. We're not passing it. We're just amending the motion at this point in time. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor of amending the ordinance as Jeff so eloquently said, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Aye. Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Aye. Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
And Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
The ordinance has been amended. Mr. Cordonier, there is a deadline of what date for the application for these grants?
June 15th, and I'd just like to add, the state puts us in a tough position. They roll out the guidelines, they roll out the program, how to apply for it. What was the date of that?
I believe May 21st was when they rolled out everything in its entirety.
So it used to be they would roll things out in February with a June application time. Every year it gets later and later and later, so we're forced to respond rather quickly to the guidance that they give us. So I do apologize if we're fiddling around, but we are put in a tough position. So that's just a little explanation of why we're switching projects and kind of hustling around at the last minute.
So then for both this ordinance 22-045 and for ordinance 22-046, they both have a deadline for application of June 15th, which means you need council's approval tonight.
That is correct.
Mr. Wobser.
As much as I guess I really don't like suspending after we've made a major change to the overall ordinance, given the timeline that we're at and the fact that they're relatively similar in scope. I would make a motion to suspend council's rules and give ordinance 2022-45 its last reading.
Second, Ms. Warnicki. All those in favor of suspending council's rules and giving this ordinance its third reading, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Greeno,
Aye.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer,
Aye.
Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman.
Aye.
Council's statutory rules have been suspended, and this ordinance will be given its third reading.
Ordinance 2022-45.
Mr. Weisner,
I move for adoption of ordinance number 2022-045.
as amended?
Yes, as amended.
Thank you. Second, Mr. Greeno. Questions or comments? Mr. Hellman.
I've got a quick question. I think I might have slipped a cog here. Are we still talking about the same parks and we're just making them ADA compliant?
That's correct.
Okay.
Ross,
For some reason, when I heard somebody talk
Well-
about it, I thought maybe you switched or added a park.
it was
or-
Cooper, Rawson and Cooper. This is Rawson and Swale.
You're adding the airport. Okay, maybe
Yeah.
that's where I got confused. All right. And I take it we have the extra 100,000 or 93,000, whatever it is.
Jeremy has indicated that, yes.
Way to sidestep that. Okay. Thank you.
Well,
appreciate
we submit the grant application, so.
Appreciate
And
your response.
and
Thank you.
on a fun side note, it's June 7th, and the website that we have to submit it on is not working. So it's due June 15th, and the portal to submit it does not work. So it's tough all around at times.
I'll give you a little sympathy for that, too. Thank you.
So we have a motion to adopt the ordinance as amended on the table. Any other questions or comments, Mr. Ballman? It's already been seconded, sir, but I appreciate your thoroughness in the matter. Other questions or comments? All those in favor of adoption of ordinance 2022-045 as amended, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Hellman,
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer,
Aye.
Mr. Palmer,
Aye.
Mr. Russell,
Aye.
Mr. Slough, Ms. Warnicki,
Aye.
Mr. Weisner,
Aye.
Mr. Wobser,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
The ordinance as amended has been adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2022-46, an ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the city of Findlay, Ohio, to execute the necessary grant application or applications and/or agreement or agreements to receive grant funds from the Community Development Block Grant Program for the small water line upgrade, project number 357-23800, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
For the reasons that were just discussed, I'd make a motion that ordinance 2022-46 be given its last reading.
Mr. Baumann, I'll give you first shot at seconding this motion. Second, Mr. Baumann. We have a motion on the table to suspend the third reading for ordinance 2022-046. All those in favor of suspending rules, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Slough. Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Weisner.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Bowman.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
And Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Council statutory rules have been suspended, and this ordinance will be given its third reading.
Ordinance 2022-46.
Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to approve.
Second, Mr. Palmer. Questions or comments? All those in favor of ordinance 2022-046, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Slough. Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Weisner.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Bowman.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
The ordinance is adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2022-47. An ordinance authorizing the mayor and/or service safety director of the city of Findlay, Ohio, to enter into a purchase agreement or agreements for the acquisition of 3 properties located on Taylor Street, Findlay, Ohio, appropriating and transferring funds, and declaring an emergency. second reading for ordinance 2022-48, an ordinance amending chapter 1100 et sec of the codified ordinances of the city of Findlay, Ohio, known as the zoning code, by rezoning the following described property referred to as Technology Drive and Midwest Court rezone, which previously was zoned C2 general commercial to M2 multifamily high density. Second reading for ordinance 2022-49, an ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the city of Findlay, Ohio, to waive formal advertising and bidding requirements and enter into a contract with RQAW Architecture for the design of the municipal court cask facility and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
We've got a contingent here from our second floor crew that would like to give us some more details on the proposed cask. So at this point, I'd ask them to come on up and give us some details that we desperately need on this ordinance.
Well, thank you for inviting us. It might be easier if you wanted to ask us questions, or we can give you another brief overview. Not sure what information you would like, but I'm sure can answer just about anything you have for us. So I know Candace has made a presentation several months ago about the concept of a cask. I don't know if you would like to have her go over that once again. If you have specific questions about where we are in the procedure or the process, we're happy to answer that as well. So we're really just here to hopefully answer any question you have, except for Mr. Greeno.
Except for Mr. Greeno, of course. Just,
Mr. Greeno.
just
knock
give
it
us
off.
the short version of what we're talking about again here.
Sure, why don't you give them a little overview?
I know,
of
yeah,
of
so give
what
us
the
an
cask is and the
overview.
purpose of it, so.
I know
Okay,
it
so
probably won't be too short, but.
Yeah, I can go on forever, but it's a community alternative sentencing center, which would be a post-conviction misdemeanor facility. It's a detention facility where we would allow for work release, for outpatient treatment, treatment as well within the facility, GED programming, life skills programming. So we're looking to find a more cost-effective facility to hold our post-conviction misdemeanor offenders instead of in the Justice Center, which is already overcrowded. This would be a facility that would also allow us to work with the offenders and potentially make progress with them before we release them out into the community to possibly be on probation.
Mr. Wobster.
Judge, I guess, or where, not sure where to start with this conversation. Where are we going to get the money from? Who's
Sure.
going to pay for this thing?
So I don't know if attached to the ordinance was the proposal from RQAW, but they have it the design schematic, or I should say the architecture part of this whole process, I think is about, one of my glasses with me, about 330?
330,000.
Well, they're projecting about $330,000. Now, that's broken down into about 6 different segments. At any point in time in this process, we can cut it off. The first segment is about $18,000. Second segment is about $40,000. The municipal court, through our special projects funds, is more than willing to fund this initial effort to see if this kind of facility is something that makes sense for the community and for the city. I should also add that the commissioners, county commissioners, have formed a jail advisory committee that has now just started in its infancy. Mayor Murin and myself are on that committee at the request of the commissioners. We have several other individuals in the community that are on that committee as well. What that committee is looking at is whether and what to recommend to the county commissioners in regards to a new jail. I think this facility, certainly we need to figure out what the cost is and if it's even feasible, because it has direct impact on what the mission of that committee is as far as what our criminal justice facilities will look like in regards to detention type facilities, and also this kind of facility that allows people to maintain employment, get the treatment as Candace has indicated. So we really would like to get to a point where we at least have a couple design build options and a cost associated with that. The jail advisory committee is certainly going to be interested in what that is as well, because of what that mission is. And again, to answer your question though, we're not asking council, administration is not asking council for any funds at this point in time to at least get us a couple stages down the road to see what we're looking at. Obviously, depending on what that comes back at, we'll be back at you with those designs, layouts, how we see those operating, and then obviously we can take a look at the big picture items as far as going forward at that point in time.
And the first step's the preliminary design that we'd be funding for $18,000. And hopefully through that process, we're gonna be looking at best practices, we're gonna be looking at other facilities, food vendors. So by the time we get to that second phase, which is the schematic design, and we have a general cost of the facility, we'd have a better idea of the flow of the facility and the policies around it to come back to you guys to see if it's gonna work for us.
So what would be the reason then that we want to waive our normal bidding requirements for this? Which is what the ordinance here, if I'm getting, I guess I want to make sure, Mr. Pro Tem President, what we're doing here is we're going past just approving to not have our normal bid process. Is that correct? That's what this ordinance is.
We sent
Like
out,
bidding
there was a
requirements.
request for proposal submitted by 3 different architects for that. They were stack ranked. RQAW came back obviously as the favorite, or as the number one choice by all people responding to that. And so that's what generated the request to enter into the contract with them to obviously start the process. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, so.
But we didn't go through our normal, I guess my point is, and Jim is standing up, which,
It's possible, and I don't know for sure, so I don't want to overstep my bounds, it's possible that language is in there retroactive to cover the fact that they did receive 3 bids based on what the judge just said.
Well, this is if you're gonna do the design build process.
Rob, could you come up to the mic? Thanks.
Since we went through in my understanding, we went through the RFQ process, so we did the scoring and ranked the firms accordingly. So we're not bypassing, the bid process is not part of the RFQ process.
okay, so
We might add
then
it.
on,
Maybe we add to that.
Yeah,
And
so
Mr.
the other part
Elliott.
of that too is for special services such as attorneys, engineers, architects like this, you can waive that bidding process based on, and what they did here, which is a ranking. So they determine that this is the group that's most qualified, or that they're most interested in moving forward in, based on the presentation they heard and the information they've been provided. For example, you could receive bids from 9 people. The lowest bid or the second lowest bid might be a much better financial decision, but they might not have anywhere near the experience or the idea of what we're doing. And especially in this case, because what they're trying to do is fund some money to give you guys an idea to how you're going to spend your money. They want someone who's got the expertise to actually do that. And so I believe, my understanding is that's why this is the recommendation.
I've got no problem that you all have made the right decision. That's not my point. My point is, this ordinance, as it reads here, is we're being asked to waive formal advertising and bidding requirements. But if you're correct, we're not actually doing that. That's in the form of a question.
Correct.
So should we amend this ordinance to get rid of that language? Mr. Elliott?
You mean Mr. Worth?
Worth, sorry.
It's all right. So I understand the question. From a technical standpoint, I don't know the answer, as far as if we have to.
This is only a second reading, so it doesn't necessarily have to be answered today unless
Perfect.
somebody's in a move to suspend rules on this, which I would think would be, have a lot of trouble getting passed.
In that case, Mr. President Pro Tem, I'm going to pass the buck on to Donnie.
Okay. Mrs. Warnicki?
Well, I have a question. Based on what you said, this ordinance is asking us to have money for the design, which you said was going to be $330,000. But then I thought you said that the first 2 phases are 58, and you or your department are going to pay that, willing to pay that.
Right.
Yes? So is this ordinance to just get started, or is it for the whole 330? And the 330, again, is just for a design. It's not to build anything, right?
Right. And your first question again was what?
Is the ordinance asking us to provide
right.
funding for the entire
So-
design or just
Right, so
started?
the court cannot contract with anyone. The court does not have any authority to contract, so we have to, through the city of Findlay, has to enter into the contract. So the request, once it's all said and done, is to authorize the mayor, the safety service director, to enter into a contract with RQAW to start the design build process. Now, we can stop it at any stage. We're not committing to the total design cost of about $330,000. That is not a commitment at all. We have that ability to stop it after stage 1, after stage 2, or anything in between. And so we're not asking for any funding from council for those initial stages.
Do we need something written in here that, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm done. That's kind of open-ended.
Well, again, we can't contract as the court, so we need the authority to do that. As far as the money, obviously, they've got that broken down, and did they get a copy of the RQAW proposal?
I don't know if that was included in the
Okay,
packet or not.
they probably should see that, but it is not certainly, we're not asking for any tax dollars, obviously, from the city to fund the initial stage or two until we obviously can get an idea of whether this makes sense to keep going forward.
And I would think that made sense if this just said like we were doing 2 stages out of 6 instead of that maybe it was the whole 6. I guess that's where I was.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, we're playing multiple mics right now. So the contract does stipulate phase after phase, and it breaks down the dollar amount that's allotted for each phase. And it was very clear when we sat down with the firm that we are not committing anything until, we're committing to phase 1. And then when we get to that point, after that, we make a decision as a group, we want to move to phase 2, and then we commit those dollars, so forth and so on as we go through. This is nothing more than a feasibility study. This is not committing to build this building. This is just nothing more than fact-finding, trying to understand the feasibility of if this will fit not only the needs of this community, but financially with what we're trying to accomplish. So it's tiered process.
Well, I'm going to call on myself here. You've answered a lot of my questions. When I read this, I'm like, we are at an architect already? I don't even know that we have land. And come to find out that there's been some conversation about a location on this. And to me, this was that we were just way ahead of the process, or where I thought we were in the process. And for all I had understood, I mean, Brad was at one meeting, and we're already, at this point. So if you're telling me that this is simply the next step in our investigation, I'm a lot more comfortable with it. Although the information that we've seen, which is really a 2-paragraph letter from Assistant City Engineer Roush, and then the ordinance is dramatically lacking. There's none of the other information was provided that's been here, and I think these are really valid questions. So we're missing a mark here someplace, and I appreciate you all coming in, at least clearing up my mind on this a little bit more. I would like to see some commitment of what, I'd like to see the financials behind the contract a little bit more, but you've at least answered my questions. Councilman Wobser?
I think most of my questions have been answered too. I understand what we're doing with this legislation, I guess. And second of all, I appreciate Mr. Beach and Judge Bishop and Judge Hackenberg and Candace being here tonight and helping us out with this and helping us to understand this. It's a big project for us and a big change in what we do today, correct? So I know we've got a lot more to discuss. So this is just going to get us on to the next initial step, correct, Judge?
Right. We have determined, certainly internally, and with certainly talking to our stakeholders and other individuals who certainly would have an interest in this, is that, we believe this kind of facility makes sense as far as how it could serve the needs of the Findlay Municipal Court and even potentially low-level felons coming out of common pleas court. We've talked about it. We understand the individuals who would be needing this. Candace has been fantastic over the last several months with the generating reports as far as who we are currently incarcerating in other outside facilities who would be eligible for this kind of cask facility. She's got all that data, and there is certainly, the data certainly supports continuing down this path as far as addressing the needs. And so at some point in time, the rubber does need to meet the road. And so we've talked about this internally. We've shared this with council over the past year. And we need to really see if this is something that financially makes sense from a cost standpoint to build, and certainly from a standpoint to operate. And the first step certainly is the cost to build. We can certainly back into, once we know what it's going to look like and the manpower, staffing, we can figure out the operational costs as well. But at some point in time, we have to start getting some kind of ideas what this facility will look like and what it's going to cost. And then that's when we need to make a decision whether it at that point makes sense financially and otherwise to continue down that path. And so we think we're at the point here, and certainly working with Rob and the mayor and engineering, that's how we got here. We have a proposal from RQAW. We can certainly make sure that everyone sees that, so you understand exactly what we're talking about and how they break it down on the costs and how it's certainly each stage is measurable as far as the quantity and what they're going to be delivering. So we'll be happy to get that to you. I don't know why that hasn't been delivered to you, but we need to make sure you see that so you understand exactly what we're talking about here. We don't expect you to fly blind on this at all. So,
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that you're going to pay for the first step. Do we have some kind of documentation, like a memorandum or anything that says the courts will pay for this first step for transparency for the public?
We don't. We can certainly produce something that would satisfy Mr. Stashak on that regard.
What I think we can do, as you guys do the review here before the next meeting, is we'll take a quick look at it and lay out and maybe add some appropriations language in this that covers what we have to set aside. And I'll have a question as to whether we need to set aside the final amounts. And if so, we'll clarify that as part of this and working with Rob.
Mr. Hellman.
That answered the question that I had, but I think we ought to, in light of all the work that's been done on this over the past year and with the committee, I think we ought to continue to think of moving forward. I think they've handled this properly. Whether they've got a specific site or not, I don't think it's going to make a big deal or a great deal of difference. And, that we could, when we approve this, we could allocate the first 2 or 3 phases of the finances that they need so that they can move forward and give this thing some direction.
I can tell you the mayor, we've had discussions with 1 or 2 different county commissioners. They have expressed a willingness to at least consider having this facility located on a stretch of property that they own off of 140. Now, we don't have a memorandum of understanding in place with them yet. They were receptive to that idea, but again, to your point, Mr. Hellman, the exact location isn't critical to at least getting a design layout and a cost associated with that. I mean, certainly we understand where it would be located drives additional factors and costs, but at this point in time, we don't want to get bogged down with a location. It may not even be important where the location is if the facility doesn't make sense across the board financially and in other ways. So,
Mr. Webster.
Judge, you also said that, I just wanted to clarify, you did say that you're in coordination with the group that's looking at potentially building a new county jail.
Yeah, Mayor Murin and myself have been asked to be on that jail advisory committee.
Okay, and you've been accepted onto that committee?
Yes.
That would be
for some reason they accepted the mayor and myself onto that. Yes, we are members of that committee. I can say that with 100% confidence. So yes, we've already had one meeting in this in your chambers here a month ago. They just met last Tuesday to do a tour of the jail. That committee has a lot of people who don't have a whole lot of familiarity with the criminal justice system, but they bring other skills to the table. And so there's a bit of a learning curve with that committee as far as getting up to speed. And so we are scheduled for, I believe, they're looking for a date for about a half day and a Saturday, where the consultants who created that jail master plan for the county a couple years ago can come in and put on a sort of a half-day sort of conference seminar on what they've come up with to educate further the committee. So that committee is finally up and running, and that's where we're at in that process.
Very good. Thank you for all for coming in tonight.
Mr. Hellman?
Yeah, I got one last question for me anyways. I assume that you did the RFQ, the request for qualifications, these people have been selected, so we're probably not gonna put this out to bid. Once you come up with this, get through the 6 phases, we're probably kind of married to these people, even though we're just dating at the point, so to speak. Would that be an accurate assessment? No?
It's phase by phase.
All right, okay. And regarding that then, should we think about this as allocating funds? We would allocate them, I don't think you wanna come in here every time you're going to the next phase. We'll allocate funds for the first 3 phases or 6 phases or whatever. How should we look at that?
Well, I guess I'll defer to Rob and perhaps Dr. Stasiak to see what they want on that, but
I would say the phases that your department is willing to cover financially, and then when it comes to the decisions for the city to actually appropriate funds, I think then that's a different discussion as we move through the process. Accurate?
Once we see the language, we'll know.
Yeah, yeah.
So do you wanna come in here 6 different times?
I like them here.
As you go-
Sure.
As you go through 6 phases, that's all I was
I think,
getting at.
I mean, if we get to that point, I definitely think that there should be, certainly, everyone should understand where we're at exactly and where we're, and answer any questions. If we get that far, that's not really too much of an inconvenience. We can certainly be here to keep everyone updated, full transparency, where we're at in the whole thing. So if we can get that far, I mean, obviously, we've got a ways to go before to get to that point, so.
Well, I hope you get to that point.
Well, I mean, it's certainly something that I think Candace we've all invested countless hours to getting to this point, to even be able to have a firm give us some kind of ideas of what it may look like and what it would cost to build, and then backing into what it would cost to operate. We have a problem. There's no sense going down that path again. It's certainly a big picture type of situation, and this is certainly a facility that at least to us who have been involved and have spent years in the system and with the current problems and where we're at, it makes a lot of sense to at least fully evaluate to see if this is something the community wants to do. I will indicate that the mayor and ourselves, we've reached out to our state legislators. We've reached out to some other individuals down in Columbus, and there is a chance that we may qualify, or there may be some interest in some funding from the state in such a facility. Very preliminary, but certainly there's interest with those agencies and with those individuals about looking at this. So we're looking at all ways to certainly lessen the burden on the city if this is something the city wants to go down the path with, that's for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Weisner?
Simple question. The funding that's coming from your guys' court, that is from people who've been sentenced, it goes into a special fund, correct?
That would be court costs, correct, that have been.
It gets allocated to your project fund, or?
Right.
Is that going, I don't know what's in there, but is that gonna dip, do you need that funding for something else, or you feel adequate, comfortable with that?
Mr. Beach, our longtime Director of Court Services, would be able to fully answer that
I don't wanna take your
question.
funding away if you had something else planned. or you
They
needed that
they tell Judge Bishop and I a lot, but they don't tell us everything, and so this is where Mr. Beach will.
We don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom. No, there is adequate funding in those accounts. We have, it's 1901-26B funds of the Ohio Revised Code. It allows us to retract certain amounts of court costs, set them aside for specific functions of the court. We have adequate funding to cover these 2 phases that the court is willing to finance. I believe we're going to forward a letter from RQAW that will lay out the exact sequence of this. As the judge said, we have step 1, step 2, step 3.
we're talking about funding step 1 and 2. If we look at 1 and we say, just isn't gonna work, we're done. We've done our due diligence. Also, one point that I wanted to make that may not have been covered, this facility has to work in conjunction with a jail. This will not eliminate the Hancock County Jail. We still need that, and they need more capacity. This is augmenting that, and it will handle at a much lower cost those folks that don't need hardened cells. To answer your question?
Yeah, and you think after the second phase, we'll know an amount, and that's the cost for the facility?
We have an idea right now, I think it's $330,000 is the cost right now for the design. But we were gonna go down through that segmentedly,
But we won't know till the end of what the actual cost is.
what the actual build cost is now.
I can go ahead. They've got an estimate of what it may be. That number was
Yeah.
based off a certain cost estimate, preliminary.
When we send you that document that they forwarded to us with a more
I've seen that.
detailed layout, it says what each step contains, and in that second step, the schematic design, there should be an estimated cost of the construction for the facility. Sorry.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
First reading for ordinance 2022-50, and ordinance,
Second reading.
second reading. An ordinance authorizing all actions necessary to support the continuation of a governmental natural gas aggregation program with opt-out provisions pursuant to section 4929.26 of the Ohio Revised Code, directing the mayor to execute a supply agreement with independent energy consultants to continue a natural gas aggregation program effective immediately and declaring an emergency.
Rob, can you give us a status of where we are with this, what our price lock is, and,
So, apologize, I did miss the last healthy discussion on this.
good reason?
Yeah, it was. Proud dad. But anyhow, the highlights of where we are, we were locked in at a ceiling for a 74 cents per unit of measure for this aggregate. And it's a 4-year term. We can reevaluate every year on the renewal of those 4 years to see where the market is, and we can adjust based on the market. But the 74 cents is where our ceiling is. I did ask, out of curiosity, since we were not, the decision was made not to pass and have the 3 readings last council meeting. First of all, I reached out to them, and they were able to lock in that 74 cents through tomorrow. Based on today's council meeting, they were not willing. I explained the situation. I asked to extend it out further, and they, at that point, were not willing to do any more than tomorrow. Just informational. With that, though, I did reach out and said, if we did not lock this in, where would we be? Ironically, we are right at the 75-cent mark at this point. I think, and I reached out today to have even a more current number than that, and I did not get an answer back, because I was wondering if this paralleled what we're seeing out at the pumps for our vehicles, and I wasn't sure of that. I didn't get an answer back. Still being at 74, 75 cents, even though they locked that in till tomorrow for us, I'm a little concerned that might have been a false sense of security on where the market's gonna go. So with that, I think this is a good option. This is a good opportunity. I did share some of the cost savings and historical information. I know those were discussion points at the last council meeting, looking forward versus retro analysis. I thought those helped quantify the value of this for the community. But again, it's an option. A couple big points, I did actually, I think the reason Ann's not here today is because she stopped in and we had a nice conversation, and her questions were answered. But with that, I think we need to do our due diligence, and we need to make sure we effectively communicate this process and over-communicate it. The firm is obligated to do that, but I think with today's technology, we have the capability to make sure the opt-out communication is in there as a choice for the citizens if they choose so.
Mr. Webster?
Rob, you've got this listed as 74 cents per unit of measure. What's the unit of measure? Is that an MCF?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Palmer?
Like Rob, I talked to Ann Spence as well the other day, and her concern was at the back end of the agreement, being notified when that current rate is gonna expire.
Yes.
Because she had run into some issues with not knowing and got hit with a pretty good bill.
Yeah, she explained, I'm sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so what is the process then for the company then? Are they supposed to send something out towards the end to say, hey, this expires?
Yes. Yeah, that, and again, their obligation is to communicate this effectively. And she shared her situation, and I think we're in a different time of communication, and I don't know if that was an outlier. So I don't want to speak to that since she's not here, but I think that we are in a better position of not only communication opportunities for the firm to do it, but us to actually make sure we're over communicating it through our avenues.
Other questions? Rob, just to confirm, citizens can opt out at pretty much any time, correct?
Absolutely.
So if come next March, the prices are down at 60, I can get 64 cents, I can opt out.
Yes, and there's no penalty to that.
Correct. So the worst, what we're talking is the worst case scenario for the next 4 years will be, people will be paying 74 cents for whatever unit of measure Jeff mentioned.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, one thing just for the public, there's a great website that the Public Utility Commission of Ohio operates that gives you apples to apples comparison for your gas and electric rates. So that's something that you may want to look into as well as this program goes on.
And that website would be known as?
PUCO.
Apples to
.OH.
apples. Yeah. PUCO, apples to apples, and that'll take you. Yep. Any other questions for Rob? Thank you, sir. Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to suspend.
Second, Mr. Palmer. We have a motion to suspend council's rules for this ordinance and give it its third reading. All those in favor of the motion to suspend, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki? Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? And Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Council statutory rules have been suspended, and this ordinance will be given its third reading.
Ordinance 2022-50.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for adoption of ordinance number 2022-050.
Second, Mr. Ballman. Questions or comments? All in favor of ordinance 2022-050, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki? Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
And Mr. Russell?
Aye. The motion or the ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2022-51, an ordinance appropriating funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Ballman.
I make a motion to suspend the rules on ordinance number 2022-051 since it's just a kind of a transfer of funds.
Second, Mr. Slough. We have a motion to suspend council statutory rules for this ordinance. All in favor of the motion, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Ms. Warnicki? Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
And Mr. Slough?
Council statutory rules have been suspended, and this ordinance will be given its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2022-51, ordinance 2022-51.
Mr. Ballman.
I make a motion for approval of ordinance number 2022-051.
Second, Ms. Warnicki. Questions or comments? One comment from myself, the banners look great, and I love seeing them, and I love reading the names and especially seeing the names of the families that are one after another on the polls. And bravo to this program, and appreciate all the citizens that like to support it. Other questions or comments? All in favor of this motion, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki?
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2022-52, an ordinance authorizing the mayor, service safety director, and/or city engineer of the city of Findlay, Ohio, to waive formal advertising and bidding requirements and enter into a contract with Capital Aluminum and Glass Corporation for the replacement of municipal building first floor lobby windows and declaring an emergency. First reading for ordinance 2022-53, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
I spoke to city engineer about this. He said that that he has if we pass this tonight, he has folks ready to go. This has been in our capex budget for a while. We have the money. For that reason, I would move that council statutory rules be suspended and ordinance 2022-053 given its second and third reading. Second, Mr. Slough. All those in favor of suspending council statutory rules and giving ordinance 2022-053 its second and third reading, please say aye after your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki? And Mr. Weisner.
Aye.
Council statutory rules have been suspended and this ordinance will be given its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2022-53, ordinance 2022-53.
Mr. Slough. Second, Mr. Greeno. Questions or comments? All in favor of adoption of 2022-053, please say aye after name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer? Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Slough? Ms. Warnicki? Mr. Weisner?
Aye.
And Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted. Old business. Mr. Harrington.
Judge Bishop has a handout she'd like to give everybody that explains a little bit more about the phasing and everything, that she went upstairs and made copies for each one of you. So, thank you.
Thank you, John. Other old business. New business. Mr. Wobser.
I'd like to call an Appropriations Committee meeting for Tuesday, June 14th at 4:30 p.m. to discuss water distribution materials. Does that sound close enough, Rob? All right. Is everybody good for that date and time? Tuesday the 14th at 4:30. We've got some city employees who'll be here, so I figured not keep them over too long. I have got a feeling this isn't going to take very long. Do you think, Rob? No. I would say third floor conference room, if it's available. If not, I'll tell you otherwise. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Baumann.
Yeah, this question might be for Rob. Just to kind of can you give an update on there at Main Street in Rosemont? You know, it's kind of tore up there, and I'm guessing that's because of the ongoing sewer project we have going on. But do you have any idea of when that will be put back like it was found?
Where's Jeremy when you need him? I do know that they're making progress, but I'm sorry, I do not have a timeline on that completion. But when it's complete, it will be back to normal. Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't have that, but I will follow up with you on that.
Other new business. Mr. Hellman.
I don't know if anybody else has had this experience lately or not, but I've been approached by 3 or 4 people in the past week or two about unmowed lawns. And I know it's kind of a mundane topic, but I have noticed them as well along Tiffin Avenue. Most of them are on commercial properties, but some of them are residential properties. I don't know if Rob has any response to that kind of stuff or not, but it is looking a little shabby in certain areas.
I agree, and it's noticeable. I've noticed it. People have commented it to me as well. Our zoning department has, as of 2 weeks ago, added an enforcement officer to the zoning. And so they've had some transition over the last year with people luckily staying with the city with talent, but moving to other departments left them a little thin. And we had a plan to transition a police officer from our department to enforcement in zoning. With staffing situations, with PD and things, we had to make sure that we had officers that came in and went through the academy and went through orientation to assure that we had the safety side of law enforcement covered. And then when that happened, then we were able to move the officer that was taking the enforcement position up to zoning. That's within the last 2 weeks. So he's getting his feet wet. We've talked through with the law director and the team about how we're doing the enforcement, but he is out there, boots on the ground. He's doing a great job. I'm confident that we're going to see some drastic changes here real soon. But I agree with you. I'm aware of it. We are addressing that. So, and I'm going to give him a few weeks, but then what I'd like to do is then I'm going to have an update for you all on the progress since we have implemented a new position to kind of show that return on the investment, if you will.
Do we have a KPI? Do we have a KPI related to that specific process? Like, I know we have one for filling a pothole.
Yeah, it's being developed.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Other new business? Seeing as though there's none, there's Mr. Stasiak. Sorry.
Real quick, it's that time of the year in your terms, the state auditor's office who emphasize public records training, sunshine law training, have put out, and I'll give this to Denise to distribute to you, a live virtual session on the 23rd of June from 10 until 1:15. To get your required hours, you have to, in this case, watch the whole one. But it does cover new changes in the laws, requirements to conduct proper meetings, executive sessions, which we have a lot of, and keep and maintain minutes, records that must be maintained, the manner in which the public office must comply with the records requests, remedies, penalties, and definitions, practical compliance, and other things in dealing with the role of the Attorney General's office in this process. So as these come out, we inform you folks, and we encourage you to take them yourself. We know sometimes that's not possible, and you do assign someone to take it for you, but with everything that's going on, and with as much as we're doing, we encourage you to learn it at least once. So thank you so much for the attention.
Is that video going to be made available to people who cannot watch it live?
That says it is not in this particular case. It's a live session, but there may be other instances where you can do that. I do know they have some other types of virtual training. This particular one's not, but I think this is a more intense training. And I got to compliment the state auditor. He's really put a good focus on this. When we went through the audit, they spent a lot of time making sure records requests are being complied with properly, and that's something I appreciate very much.
Seeing as though there's no more new business. Oh.
We're running on overtime here compared to what we usually do. But I think, I apologize, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to just talk about, last week we had an unfortunate event in our community at the Drury Inn. We had a hostage situation I'm sure you're all aware of. You've read it in the paper, whatever the case might have been. I just want to point out our tactical EMS team, our ERT team, so fire, police, our dispatchers, the sheriff's office assisted on that as well. I can tell you our command staff, top to down, from the top all the way down, couldn't be more proud on how they executed that long, lengthy 12-hour situation. Our negotiating team, I know I'm probably missing a few people, but I had the opportunity to observe and be out there. I'd like to say as a resource, but I was just observing the talent and the professionalism of our safety services that conducted themselves and had the outcome that we wanted. Everyone went home at the end of the day and everything was resolved peacefully. So I commend Chief Eberly and Chief ring, as well as everyone else that was involved. The training that goes on, you don't see that. And we do train, and we execute it, and we actually had to run a drill the other day, and it went off very, very well. So I applaud them, and I think you need to know the level. I know you know that, but I wanted to make sure we had that noted tonight, how well that went the other day. So, thank you.
Mayor and I have been discussing about going back to our original seating arrangements. So in other words, the mayor, the auditor and such will then sit here. I think we're gonna, if it's okay with council, I think we would start that in our first meeting in July. So the second meeting this month. In 2 weeks, we would remain this, but in the first week of July, we're gonna go back to that seating. It's obviously, you know, if the pandemic would take a turn for the worse, or there'd be another issue, we would address it then. But I think if everybody agrees, I think we're able and capable of going back to our hearing no objections. I assume that'll be okay.
Nope, I object.
Okay.
I'm serious. I think we should stay where we're at, Mr. Harrington. Pro Tem Mayor.
I would say that
I would agree that we should stay where we're at. I think this sits very well for us, and I think we should stay here.
I appreciate that. With one objection, I ask that you then poll council and then decide based on a majority. Thank you.
Anyone else? There's been a request to go into an executive session to discuss a legal matter. At the conclusion of that, we will come out of executive session and adjourn the meeting and conduct no other business. So with that, we do need a motion to go into executive session. Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to go into executive session to discuss a current legal situation and no further business to be conducted after that is over.
A second by Mr. Hellman. All in favor of going into executive session, please say aye. Those opposed, same sign. And we are headed into executive session.